Greetings, Varlets! Welcome to Rosario Rants, that time of the month where I pontificate on whatever subjects catch my fancy. Usually about Warhammer, but maybe one day I'll touch on other subjects. My nerddom is vast. Anyway, so recently I watched this very interesting video called the D&D-ification of Fantasy, which sparked the idea for today's topic. In it, a YouTuber named JBat is making the case that D&D has been a standardizing influence on the fantasy genre, and how this phenomenon might be affecting it negatively. And at one point in the video, he makes this comment which got my mind whirling.
So very recently, we did a big Q&A for the channel, and a wonderful viewer of mine, Saint Sir Nicholas, asked, will you make books based on your RPG setting? And in answering this question, I was provoked to a kind of interesting thought, because my setting is a novel setting I made an RPG out of, not an RPG I made a novel out of. And I realized that has a pretty distinct effect. My world was not created with the needs of a tabletop RPG first, but the needs of a novel, and thus, in practical terms, there are significant differences between my setting as a novel and as an RPG.
As with all things, this got me thinking about Warhammer 40K. Now, if you follow JBat's logic, Warhammer 40K would then fall under tabletop strategy game Games Workshop made novels of. These novels have garnered a lot of fans over the years, and I'll occasionally hear some of them say things like GW should progress the story, or the Emperor should come back. But what would that look like? And is that really a good idea for this setting? So how can we answer these questions? Well, there's actually a case study to be made using a certain genre of video games that has similarities to Warhammer 40K's competitive gameplay, and whose developers have oftentimes decided to progress their respective stories. I'm of course talking about fighting games. Now, if you think about it, fighting games are very similar to tabletop strategy games. They both involve players fighting against each other in some form of deathmatch to see which player comes out victorious. Usually, the player has a vast cast of characters, or in the case of tabletop strategy games, factions, to choose from. Both games are set up with balance in mind so that a player is able to win no matter which character or faction he or she chooses. So this is the core of the setting, a game first, a game where anyone can win. Now, of course, these characters or factions need to have something to entice the players to choose them. And this is where the aesthetics and story of these come into play. Fighting game developers create the arena for our characters to fight in, as well as the characters themselves. They give all of them reasons to fight, and an interesting hook or aesthetic to make them stand out from other playable characters. The same can be said for TTS games. Selecting Ryu in Street Fighter should feel very similar to selecting Ultramarines in Warhammer 40K. And despite Ryu's well-balanced gameplay, to the point where most players will choose him, Street Fighter is set up so that any playable character has the opportunity to win. Same with Ultramarines. The Space Marines are the faction most balanced in Warhammer 40K, which makes it so that most players will choose them. But this doesn't mean that the player who selects Orcs or Eldar don't have a chance to win. But you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with the story progression in Warhammer 40K? Well, the case I am making is that the point of Warhammer 40K, like in fighting games, is that any faction can win. It is not in the best interests of settings like TTS's and fighting games to have a definitive winner. That's why fighting games have multiple endings which show the player character winning the tournament. It would suck if after winning the tournament with Blanca, players would have to sit there and watch the true ending in which Ryu wins. So how does this translate to a TTS with a whole slew of novels? Well, by writing victories for each of their factions. Write stories where the Imperium fights off a Tyranid planetary invasion in one book, but then lose another planet to the Orcs in the next book. Write books where the POV character could be anyone from across the entire line of factions, not just the Imperium. This method serves the spirit of the setting. But you might also be thinking to yourself, well, fighting games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat have progressed their stories, and that's true. Street Fighter is currently in its 6th iteration, and Mortal Kombat is up to 12 games already, not including the spin-offs. But can you really say their stories have progressed? Again, let's take a look at Street Fighter. Bison, the boss of the original games, has already died several times in the series. And even the most recent "No Really Guys, He's Dead for Real" of Street Fighter V was undone with Street Fighter VI's DLC. And that's because it doesn't serve the Street Fighter games to lose Bison. Too many players already invested in him and love playing as him. So getting rid of the character for good would be a loss for Capcom, because those players will demand that Bison return, and may even stop playing Street Fighter because they no longer have access to their main. So they come up with convoluted and hackneyed reasons for why he's back, thus cheapening the character and the story in the process. And it is happening across multiple fighting games. So if GW starts progressing their story, what would that mean for their game? Look at what happened with the deaths of characters like Commissar Yarrick or Lord Castellan Creed. These deaths really upset the fanbase to the point where they're actively hating other replacements GW has created. Players had already grown attached to these characters and had them in their army lists. GW progressed their story without considering that they are a TTS game first and a series of novels second. Let's take a look at another example from GW's playbook, one of their most controversial and divisive story progressions to date, The End Times. For those of you who don't know, The End Times was a vital chapter of GW's original game, Warhammer Fantasy. Spoilers FYI. In it, Chaos finally wins against the mortal world and destroys existence itself. Now, mileage may vary on the quality of the book series, but one thing is for sure, this was devastating to the game itself. The End Times outright destroyed it. Sure, some people still play the game here and there, but the fan base is nowhere near as big as it once was. It has been relegated to people who just decided to cut ties with GW and just play the game among themselves. Many 3D printers have been going brrr since then. And what of GW's continuation of the story? The game and setting now known as the Age of Sigmar. Well, the game and its novels have suffered from an incredibly poor reception and a slow start due to the backlash they received from Warhammer Fantasy's original fanbase. Players have turned their noses at it for not being as good as the original or outright boycotted it. Since then, we've seen GW try to revive Warhammer Fantasy with Old Warhammer, but fans have since moved on. So remember, the setting for tabletop strategy games are made with stalemate and conflict in mind. The end of these will mean the end of the setting. So novelists trying to write stories in these settings should keep that in mind. That's why it wouldn't be in WH40K's best interest to have the story progress. WH40K story should give us victories and defeats, but not definitive ones. But what do you Varlets think? Do you think the story should progress? And how do you think it should be handled? Let me know in the comments. I have been Interrogator Rosario, attaché to Inquisitor Markham of the Order Hereticus, and I'm signing off from the Grim Dark feature. Bye-bye, Varlets, and remember that it's better to be safe and ignorant than ruining the means of our downfall. If you like what you heard, then please feel free to drop it in the comments or hit me up on Instagram at Rosario Divas Art, or you can watch my live streams over on Twitch, which is also at Rosario Divas Art.